Hello everyone. Welcome back to IULM Flow. We are here in our university attending the course of creativity and design. And today we have the pleasure to have our guest, Meg Pagani, who's going to talk to us about power and purpose, leadership of a new paradigm. From what emerged from the World Economic Forum, one of the skills that will be needed in this year, if we look at the point number 3, it's creativity, originality, and initiative, which perfectly links what the discussion of today will be about. So if Meg, you are ready, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being here.
No, thank you for the invite. I'm going to wait for the slides to be pulled up on screen. Thank you. So I always like to start with a little bit of our thought-provoking reflection. And in this case, I would love to ask you if, did you know that African acacia trees can warn each other of danger? It is, in fact, has been proven that these trees release a chemical called ethylene that can travel up to 45 meters, warning each other or warning other acacias in the vicinity. So within 15 minutes, all the neighboring trees or the trees that are close by increase the tannin levels of their leaves. In other words, they make their own leaves pretty poisoning and unappetizing to tree browsing animals. And the reason why I wanted to start with this is because if there is one thing that we know about the current times that we're living is that we're questioning the very nature of our reality. We're questioning, in fact, if trees can warn each other or communicate to each other and change their behavior to defend themselves from animals, for example. Things that up to a few years ago we would consider Disney material. The thing that I think it's important to talk about in the context of questioning the nature of our reality is that in the moment in which we question the nature of our reality, we also question our relationship to it. We start having to confront questions like what is me and what is other, or how do we create value? What is our role to play within that context? And as I like to say, there is nothing like the taste of yet another existential crisis after 2020, 2021. But it's true. And it is what we're experiencing at the moment is what we commonly call a shift of paradigms. And in order to talk about this, I as you will discover more and more as this conversation continues, I'm pretty nerdy. So I like to talk about a change of paradigms using what many of you might have already recognized, a metaphor that comes from Game of Thrones. Some of you might remember that in the Game of Thrones series, at some point, there is this expression that is used, the old, the gods, and the new. And what they refer to is the old paradigm of belief systems and the one emerging. And why do I choose this expression, knowing that there is such a loaded word like gods? Because even if we tend not to be very aware of it, with our devotion, dedication, and discipline, we are disciples of very specific belief systems, of very specific paradigms that we reinforce, again, knowing or not knowing about it. One of the key questions of the emerging paradigm and the one that we're confronted by is around the concept of value. Because the paradigm that we are living, the old one, knows very well how to put a value or a number on a dead whale somewhere on a boat, but not on an alive whale that is in the ecosystem where he or she are supposed to live and doing what he or she are supposed to be doing in terms of contribution to the very ecosystems that we, on top of everything, depend on. These type of questions is the ones that the new paradigm is confronting us with. And if we needed to put this on a timeline or on a framework to figure out where are we on the journey, we're right there. If we wanted to use the hero journey from Campbell, we are at that return point where after decades or even centuries of doing things in a certain way, we're sort of thinking or rethinking back at, okay, what happened? Why are we doing things the way we're doing, etc. And it's interesting because if we want to trace back when this cycle started, we have to trace it back and identify its origin in one of the ages in history that tends to be spoken about in a pretty positive light, Renaissance, for instance. Some of you might know already that around the Renaissance times, we had a macro shift of paradigm. We went from thinking that the Earth was at the center of the universe to understanding that we are in a solar system where the sun, with the sun at the center and different planets revolving around it. To that macro shift of paradigm, there was a micro one that is easy to be explained using these two references. As some of you might know, there is a slightly overlap period before Renaissance called humanism. Because when we realized that our universe has the sun in the middle, and there is all these planets, and the universe is this vast land of unknown territories and space to be explored and conquered, then the consequent belief system that we formed it, who is the most fit living being to go on such quest? And our answer at that time has been men. At the time, of course, we're talking about white, privileged men, not just human beings. So our belief system was established as men-centered, where man is owner of his destiny, where the goal of man or the objective of his doing is the domination of nature and the domination of the wild. You can only imagine what happens when the wild or the unknown become different cultures or people with another color of skin. Renaissance was nothing more, nothing less than the application of that knowledge. Science started to thrive because we needed tools to face these so-called challenges of the unknown. And especially we started to be pretty obsessed with the immediate rewards, in contrast with the religious, story of the reward in the afterlife. The consequence of this crystallization of belief system we are seeing today. And here in this slide, of course, we're seeing just the ones that we have on the environment. There is many others on cultural and social fronts as well. So back to the shifting paradigms, what we are experiencing is that we're going from the old gods that say mankind is the center of the universe and must dominate nature to mankind is part of the universe and must honor nature with a reverence that is important to offer to something that we understand we not only are part of, but we depend on. So while in the impact and sustainability space, we often talk about, innovation as if the things we're talking about are a stretch forward, like another discovery, something we need to somehow reach. In reality, what we are experiencing is a return moment, a remembering and a going back to those principles that we actually lost sight of along the way. And before we continue, I'd love to be very clear about a conversation we're going to have today, because I would love it to be a more honest one. In the context of a rising conversation, a growing amount of trends and allegedly efforts on the impact and sustainability space, because I think that there is sides of these conversations that are not often spoken about, and I would love to cover them with you today. So as every conversation, I would love to start with introducing myself. My full name is Margherita Pagani. I'm Italian, but after so many years that I spent abroad, 5 years in Latin America, now 3 in Portugal, my name was misspelled so many times that please call me Meg, it's just easier. So I live now in Lisbon, Portugal, but I come from a very small town in the north of Italy. And my journey in entrepreneurship started pretty early. You can in fact see me here where with 2 years and a half, I packed my stuff, went downstairs to my parents and I told them I'm leaving. And they're like, you're what? And I'm like, I'm leaving, because something is not adding up and I just need to figure it out. So I was very early in declaring to the world that I was going to somehow making my own way in answering the questions that felt compelling to me. Fast forward, as I'm mostly known today for my work, again, in entrepreneurship and in tech, the tendency is to believe that I studied finance, while instead I studied fine arts. I studied fine arts in Brera, 2 years in Milan, and 1 year in Bilbao in Spain. And the type of training that I received was less about numbers and lines of code or spreadsheets, but this type of codes. So the stories and the symbols and the archetypes that we paint, for example, at the time in the only community centers we knew, the only spaces where we would go aside of our own homes, where we somehow formed with these stories our belief of how life happens, how society works. And this is just one example, right? But if we think back about what we find in our art and culture or representations in faith spaces, what are the leaders? What type of leaders are them? What are the people of color? What are they doing in these representations? What are the women? What role do we have given them in those stories? And those stories, those lines of codes I came to understand form our very behavior, which then sustain what we call society or reality. So you can only imagine that if you're a professional volleyball player, you graduated in art, you love codes and languages, technology, sociology, and so on, and it's 2011. Some of you might know that there was a big economic crash in 2008, followed by one in 2011 in Europe. This was me in 2011 in graduation. There was no way for me to find a space where all my passions could express and with the freedom and the level of integrity that I wanted to have. So luckily for me, 2012 happened. So the very next year, I started to travel in what today is about 30 countries and participate to some of the biggest roundtables and networks or communities around the topics of impact, sustainability, and purpose as a whole. So I started really to dive into different spaces where I could study the various approaches to social innovation, to technology, to impact. This led me to found one of the organizations that I'm known for today, impacton.org, that has one mission, which is to spread what works and to use technology to make what already works out, like, accessible to a variety of actors at the same time on a global scale, with a specific goal not only to find the best practices, but to make them adaptable so they can be reapplied to different contexts, but adapting it to every different location. So really going from simply multiplying in sequence the projects that work to multiplying the impact more than the organizations. So you can only imagine that if those are the questions that moved me and my teams for years, one of the main things that we were focusing on is trying to figure out what are the parameters that we must look at in order to identify what works. So of course, operational feasibility and economic sustainability, but what else? So we started to analyze literally thousands of projects from all around the world. And we started seeing something that I found, and I still do find, quite alarming, which is we keep talking about accelerating the transition for purpose, for sustainability, whatever other word we want to use. But in reality, we see that more than 90% of the projects that we call solutions today actually perpetuate the same form of abuse that we theoretically are up against. So for example, we have the plaster projects. You can think about aid, and don't get me wrong, aid is very, very important. We need to address humanitarian crises or environmental crises as they happen, but we're not supposed to have a Band-Aid on a wound for 15 years. That's not sustainable development, at least not to me. Or what I call the Game of Thrones projects. We find these approaches specifically in activism where we desperately wanted to frame the enemies, and we have this narrative very Game of Thrones-ish, which is like, oh, you're the enemy, you're doing things wrong, let me take your place instead. Literally perpetuating the type of violence and approaches that we are trying to eradicate on a global scale. Or again, last but not least, the codependent relationship projects, as I like to call them, which is, I will give you some solutions, but I also will make sure that you will be depending on my solution. Calling it empowerment, but literally taking away the power of communities that actually have or could have the means to respond to those challenges on their own, mostly specifically without our intervention. And to make an example of this, I normally use these three projects. The three of them are projects that, from their websites and the Sustainable Development Goals and their impact reports and impact theories, they all focus on access to water, probably one of the most important global challenges at the moment, and since always, really. But while the first one was actually one of the worst cases known in history on impact, it's called Play Pump. It was project that allegedly was setting up this merry-go-rounds structure that would pump water out of the soil. Then when it was replicated all over the world, of course, it demonstrated that when you design something that is not designed based on the community needs and with the community, you tend to impose things that don't work out. For the final, the final scenarios or the result of that series, I really suggest that you go and look for Play Pump project. To the second one here below, they uses local materials to train local communities in building their own water tank and rare harvesting water tank to use both for agriculture and private use with local materials, local skills. To the third one, that is the most known one, multi-awarded, Life Straw, that places in villages these water tanks made on plastic with water filters, if I'm not mistaken, from Switzerland. And yes, of course, the village will have access to potable water for a while. But once these tanks break, or once these filters run out, we're back to ground zero, and that cannot be called sustainable development. Even if, of course, today we still call it sustainable development. So this, to me, became one of the main things to talk about when we talk about leadership and purpose, or the purpose economy, which is the great danger that we have to face when we start to talk about sustainability on anything and without questioning some of the parameters that we just mentioned. Because if this is the age of sustainability, anything, maybe the first and most important question we want to ask is, do we want to sustain this? Is this an approach that we actually believe in? And in my perspective, there is only two options, really. One is the compliance-driven approach. So let's keep doing this and let's figure out a way to report on things in a way that meets current regulations, eventually leading to what we know today as social washing or greenwashing, or the red pill. And the red pill, to me, is the understanding or developing the capacity and the leadership to accept that our belief systems on value, on power, or life that then create and sustain the society and the organizations or the projects on impact and sustainability, and they retrofeed each other, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the invisible that creates the visible, not the other way around. And in my personal journey, that led me to identify what I call the other side of impact, a topic that I talk about more or less on a monthly basis through a newsletter you can find on my website, but that in particular focuses on the difference that we must now deal with between this idea of impact and sustainability as an invention, as a stretch forward, versus a transformation based on principles we lost sight of. And in particular, in my case, this led me to start to look for the other ways of knowing. The other ways of knowing being philosophies, traditions, or indigenous cultures that I started to spend more or less 1/3 of my time with. Because if I couldn't find ways to approach these things in a more healthy way in the culture that I belong to or that I come from, the European and American-centric one, I also knew that there were cultures on the planet that never lost sight of these principles. That when, I mean, this is a true story with Benki, the leader of the Ashaninka community in Brazil, this indigenous community that I spent time with in January, that said, I really don't understand the way you talk about, the way you guys, your society, your culture talks about circular economy. It is with this language of like innovation and having to crack a very complex equation, but we have been doing circular economy, it sounds like, for about thousands of years. So we don't understand why you talk about it as if it's something you're inventing. And so I spend 1/3 of my time diving into these cultures and going back to the roots of what I call the way of the forest in the attempt to decode some of the language and the tools that hopefully can inform another way to approach leadership, impact, and sustainability from now on. So if we can refer to all this, if we want, as the psychology of impact, on the other side of this, there is the for impact leadership. So actually, how do we do this and which tools can we use to do it? One of the formulas that I really like to use normally is that impact is something that can be decoded as power for purpose, or multiplying power for purpose. And power is an interesting word because we actually don't really like it. We only know power generally in the context of the abuse of power, but without looking at power, we cannot talk about purpose. In fact, we can trace back very specific phases, if you want, of power. One is the access to power, or actually, sorry, access to knowledge, or actually access to power. The second phase is when we start experimenting with our powers. And we sort of, that's a phase when we sort of try to figure out how far can we go using our powers, like how much can we stretch and bend and break using our powers. And that's a pretty dangerous phase that I believe we're sort of stuck with at the moment, because there is this irresistible nature of the immediate outcomes that we have in that phase. Destruction and the race for infinite growth are led by these thirst and addiction to the experimenting. How far can we take it? And now maybe it comes a time to realize that yes, we can bend and stretch and break anything we lay our eyes on, but do we want to? And that's when the third phase starts, is the conscious application of power, which is that phase in which we realize that it's not anymore about accessing powers, but about how we use them. So your why, your how, and your what for. And when I started asking myself, which tools could we decode, which scheme could I draw on a paper to try to apply this and help other people apply it as well, as much as possible, this framework came up. You might be knowing this already. Simon Sinek is an author and a thought leader, and he came up with this framework where it talks about mostly individual purpose. Starts from why, starts with your why, and then figure out the how and the what and what you want to do. And I do agree with that, but my father was a theologian and a psychologist, and my mom is an educator, so I know a lot about, and since a long time, cognitive sciences. And to me, the why is not the purpose. The why is your needs, your drive, or in other words, your motive. And that's pretty universal. We actually share very similar motives and or needs on a global scale, both as individuals and as organizations. The what is what we have or what we do. The how is how you do it, how you apply what you have. And the what for is your cause or your objective. And literally the how and the what for are where purpose can be decoded. Because if we wanted to make an example, Patagonia from the why and the what is like pretty much like any other apparel company. If we look at the powers they have in terms of like machineries and resources and tools and assets, it's pretty similar to H&M, but it's the how and the what for, or better said, their what for and therefore the how that is coherent with that makes Patagonia be the company that it is, and the purpose-driven company, if we want, as we know it. And this can be applied literally to every single person or organization that is interested in repurposing their powers. So it comes a question, really to close up, because I would love to leave as much as possible time for your questions. Okay, Meg, but how? And I think that one of the most important ways to approach this and to navigate this is to remember that we tend to think about change like this, going from A to B. Then at some point it dawns on us that a change is actually a journey, it's not that linear, it's like this. But then there is a third layer, and I need to thank some of the other ways of knowing also for teaching me this, that is not even a journey like that, it's a journey like this. Between A and B, there is T, that stands for transition. It's those moments where either individually or as organizations or as a society, we're not anymore capable to stand or stay behind the things that we used to stand for, but we're not yet quite sure how to do things either. We just know that we're not yet that and not anymore what we were. And so we are stuck in transition. And transition is a phase that is interesting because it doesn't work like A and it doesn't work like B yet. It has very different laws that we need to somehow not only learn, but also experiment and practice with. And the most important thing, in my opinion, to remember about this is that our generation, wanting it or not, and I'm not talking just about the millennial generation that I belong to, but the generation of the people that feel that we are the sons and the daughters of very specific questions that these times are confronting us with, that generation is a generation of bridge makers, pontifex in Latin, bridge makers between people, between sectors, between these A and B. And we might feel frustrated about it, but at some point we can also move beyond it and figure out that we do have the tools to navigate this. And that those bridges that we would love to find are built with the steps that we take, the things that we figure out as we go together. And it's also important to remember, and this is really my Italian coming up, that la bellezza salverà il mondo. Beauty will save the world. But I'm not referring to the fine art beauty that I studied with or the aesthetical beauty that sometimes we focus on when we need to, when we want to work on impact or sustainability, so the surface one. I'm talking about the beauty of the feeling that we have when we take responsibility and we take the opportunity to rethink, to redefine, to rebuild, and to return to the other ways of knowing that we have lost sight of. And then we can start with that journey of rethinking anytime we want. Thank you very much for your time. And of course, I would love to hear as much as possible or as many questions as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you again. Let's now, after the presentation that I personally think was brilliant, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Let's now go to the Q&A session. For those who joined later, we're gonna do from the class a Q&A session with questions the class of creativity and design prepared and want to ask to Meg Pagani. Okay, let's now start. I'll leave the floor to my colleagues. You can come and sit here.
Hello, my name is Ada. Hi, I'm a student here in Milan, but I'm from Sweden. And my question is, do you think there'll be more strict laws in the future regarding companies' sustainability in the environmental perspective? And if so, how do you think the new laws in the future will affect companies?
How much time do you have? I do think that regulations will eventually increase as our consciousness of the need for new ways of approaching value creation will also grow, right? I do think regulations for sure will increase. The direction in which they will increase, that is probably the most dangerous path to try to forecast on. I think that I can speak of what I would love to see in regulations, which is more approach on, the integration of sciences like behavioral sciences and ways to look at how a company creates value proportionally to the assets they have, and not too much with the compliance of specific things to tick on a checklist. I sadly don't have more elements to offer in terms of forecasting what the regulations trend could go for, but I do think that the obvious next step for regulations, given the amount of work that was done on the environmental side, will start to grow more and more in the, if you want, the S and the G of the ESG, so the social and the governance aspect of the value creation in a new way that right now are either overlooked or not considered too much.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is
Hi.
Cameron. I study in Milan, but I'm originally from the US. And my question is about the Met Gala last weekend. There was a lot of eco-friendly red carpet looks. A lot of celebrities decided to wear something upcycled using old materials from previous Met Galas that designers designed. And do you believe that this holds power and purpose?
I mean, it is definitely a situation that I would consider power and purpose, because I didn't have the time to cover it in a short presentation like today, but in the programs that I do on power and purpose, there is one element that we normally look at, which is the sphere of influence. So as part of your assets and as part of your power, you want to look as an individual or an organization to which ones are your spheres of influence. And when it comes to celebrities, when it comes to influencers, of course, there is a very big sphere of influence, a very big platform and audience that you have, and the way you decide to use it and what you want to visibilize or to establish as a new way of doing things, for sure, it is a situation of power and purpose. Then you ask me if that is in general a purposeful, the Met Gala, a purposeful situation, I probably would disagree, but on other levels, not necessarily on the upcycle or not of this clothing, because there is an author that I really admire for his work in this sector, which is Charles Eisenstein. He's a mathematician from Yale, and he's an author. And amongst the books that he wrote is one on climate change as well. And he says there is 4 priorities when it comes to sustainability. And the first one is protect our environments, like whatever is left of our wild, if you want, natural ecosystem. The second is regenerate the ones that we start using or misusing so that they can get back to being in full health. The third one is find alternative materials. And the fourth one is stop putting toxicity and poisoning the environment in the first place. And this is an order of priority. So when I see upcycled material, I can definitely appreciate the effort of, priority number 4 in terms of stop putting toxicity in the environment and do something else with it. But eventually, I think that we should start going at the very source of the value creation equation and say, okay, how else can we produce? What materials can we use actually, so we don't need to put so much effort and so much power in trying to, capture these things and upcycle them into high fashion ways? Because there is other ways in which these things can be done, and the environmental side of power and purpose, as I said, is just one of them. How are these clothes done? What are the human rights issues of the supply chain? Do we want to continue having a celebrity-driven idea of success? That if you don't have that type of success, you're not that worth. Do we want to keep visibilizing? And, the same way we try to make enemies, also we try constantly to figure out who the hero can be. I personally think it is, in general, a power and purpose situation, but it's not the most compelling one that we could do with such environment and sphere of influence, in my opinion.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Molly and I'm from Sweden. So before this, I had a look at your website, Impact On, and I read about the toolkits that I found very interesting, and I would just like to know more about them. So my question is, which of the toolkits do you find the most popular among organizations to implement, and why do you think that is?
Thank you so much also for taking the time of looking at the website and the toolkit. That website is about to change quite drastically, so you probably were amongst the last people that will see it for what it has been over the last few years. But it will not change in its core purpose. I would say that the tools or the toolkits that the most I see used by organizations, and if by organizations we mean especially private sector organizations, I definitely would say that we see mostly the tools, again, toolkits on environmental transition, or the E of the ESG. How to have, more paper and plastic recycled, or LED instead of other forms of lighting and energy, and the supply chain aspect of doing things. And as I said, I think the reason why the environmental side of this new paradigm is so much more developed and dealt with than the social and the governance side is because our belief system, as we said earlier, comes from a place of strong belief that we are not nature, that we are above nature and better than nature and separated from nature. So let's deal with nature, which is less important. And again, compliance-driven regulations started to require specific type of certifications and ways to report on the environmental side of things. Because in the moment in which we want to touch the, in my opinion, more important toolkits that are more on the social and the governance, so the power application side of an organization, we need to question the very nature of our reality. We need to question which belief systems are we acting from, which types of idea of leadership and power application are we actually putting in place, both with our partners and providers and with our workforce. And that is a very uncomfortable conversation. And there is a very controversial set of best practices that are arising in the governance, for example, because some of the big companies that the most are polluting and continuing to deploy strategy to pollute the world suddenly have, indigenous communities representative in their boards that don't have, for example, the power to vote. So they're there, they are listening, they're part of the conversation, but are they given the power to actually steer the direction of these big Titanics sometimes? So I think the most, famous or most adopted toolkits tend to be, in general, as an industry, on the environmental side. I believe it's because we still have this story of separation, the way Charles Eisenstein talks about it, instead of, which I also think is probably a matter of phases, instead of the next type of conversations that are going to be arising, which is based on the assets of the organization. What is a proportional, not give back, not this two steps economy thing, an idea that we came up with, but how do we create value, and is that an healthy way? And how else do we want to create value in alignment, instead of trying to replenish, in alignment of this new paradigm of honoring people and nature as one thing. I think that's the reason.
Okay, thank you very much. Perfect.
Thank you. All brilliant questions, by the way. Thank you so much.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Alessandra Maltempi, and what I wanted to say today is I think that nowadays we can say that if a company is not sustainable, or it will easily fail, or it will have some damages and stuff like that. Here we have an example of greenwashing, as you already said before. So what I wanted to stress is, does this mean that being sustainable is equal of having power? I don't know if you get my question.
We'll see if I do. You'll tell me as soon as I answer. Definitely, if you apply today whatever strategy of sustainability, it is a way for you to hold on to power. Because mostly, especially the companies that you put on your examples are definitely, the old power type of organization. So when you roll out such things, you definitely are making a power move. It's like, I have it. I can definitely align with the sustainability. But as I said, and this is my main struggle today, even with the words of impact, purpose, and sustainability, is that purpose or impact, like power, don't mean anything on their own. We tend to put this on these reports, like sustainability reports, as if sustainability or impact or purpose per se mean something, but they don't mean something unless you look at the how and the what for are you actually taking action for. Because, and this is a very known example, Nike and the upcycle plastic product. If you have one product of your 2,000 probably, and you use it to make me enter in your shop, like H&M and Zara, for example, and we know that you have designed and probably applied the best brains of interaction design applied to retail and to spaces. For me to get into your shop and probably exit with maybe one product of allegedly sustainable value, which again, like supply chain, workforce, contracts, and so on, a totally different and non-addressed dimension in that product. But then I leave with other 3 or 4 or whatever amount of products that are absolutely not like that. So what is the power you're applying this? And again, how? And again, what for? So I think there is power, sadly, and the aesthetic force that, if you want my fine art background, trained me so well in, and the misusage of it, right? I do think, though, and I'm going to be completely honest, we are luckily generations that have and are benefiting from the education that we were able to access in one way or another, and including the education given to us by the information technology revolution. The fact that someone, Sir Bernard-Lee, decided not to capitalize the World Wide Web, so the WWW, so internet became the free environment that we know today. I'm very close to cyber hacktivism, and I know that part of this education is also thanks to that. So yes, to say it very straightforwardly, we're, even if it's like sometimes we do have this feeling like, do they think we're stupid? Probably they do, but we are gaining more and more capacity, and that's why I think, and I believe strongly in our generation and the next ones, to sort of make sure that they understand that we're not, and to shift from shaming these organizations to holding them accountable, offering the creative power and the side thinking that they might not have.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. You answered my question, and it was very nice. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you.
Okay, we still have some few questions.
I'll try to be shorter in my answers, but they're all very interesting questions.
I don't want to see some sad faces for being left out.
No. We're not going to leave out anybody.
No, okay. So sorry, you go.
Hi, I'm Chiara. So before coming here, I had a listen to one of your TED Talks that you gave a few months ago. And it got me thinking about the meaning of sustainability and how there is this tendency of considering only the environmental aspect of it instead of also considering planet and people. So my idea is that it's a bit losing value. So I wanted to ask you, what does it mean sustainability for you actually? And how can we start to believe its impact?
Okay, I'll try to make this very short. I thank you for watching the TEDx. It was a very emotional moment for me because I was terrified of sharing these viewpoints. Never done it before, so thank you for that. Sustainability, I really have an issue with that word now, as I think with impact and many share my feelings. What I think I can answer with is, if this organization or person was an organism, was a plant, like the way of the forest that I was talking about, what would it be like? Like, what is this organism about? And what this organism is doing, is it proportional? Is it healthy? The way it's using its power, is it degenerative? Is it life-taking? Is it extracting more from the ecosystem? In nature, we call it cancer, or we call it toxicity. Or is it life-giving? Is it regenerative? Is it imbalance in what it takes, how it transforms it, and what it gives back, like this double flow of nature? That's my compass, because I don't have many answers to that question yet, at least personally, but that's my compass when I need to look at sustainability and the wisdom that I think we can draw from when we want to start giving those answers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Alberto. I'm from Sardinia. My question is a bit more political than the others. I would ask you, how do you, if you think that the world leadership held by now from the United States will soon pass to China, and also if we want to link it with sustainability, we can take into consideration the role that China is playing in actually wanting to take the leadership of the sustainability game?
Thank you for that question. I'm not a geopolitics expert. I actually have one of my favorite professors, Professor Eva in Milan, that very often holds like open lectures about this. So if you're interested, look him up, Fabrizio Eva. What I can say is that China did actually pass by and led the way for some of the ecological transitions as we know them today. From the infrastructure perspective, again, we need to remember the way China approaches also the production and the infrastructure setting. It's enough to go to any of the building sites or the working sites in Africa to see the approach of China as a culture to workforce, for example, or to environment, for example, or to economic power and power fights. So I also, I'm sorry to say, I don't have an answer to your question. I can only say, though, that China in many ways did pass that race, like did pass America or the US in that race. And then right now, of course, including the war and everything, those dimensions are becoming extremely more complex. And I don't think I have the background or the time to properly answer this question. But I think it's a very valid one, especially when we started to having to deal with the actually globalized economy that we have today. So thank you for your question. And I'm sorry I don't have a straightforward answer to that yet.
Don't worry. Thank you for your time.
Hello, I'm Lucia. My question concerns more leadership. So how can a leader prevent power, like you talked about power before, how can a leader prevent power from getting to their heads, therefore influencing negatively their actions?
It's a brilliant question, and I love it. It draws on some of the main and core focuses of my work and research at the moment and the programs that I do on power and purpose. In your phrase, power is intended in a negative way, which is how our culture normally refers to power. We only know power in the context of power abuse. So we tend to think, okay, if you're driven by power, like ego, it's gonna be bad. I personally believe, again, it's not about the what, but the how and the what for. It's not about the power per se, but the power literacy that we hold. We, as human beings, are the only mammals that take, someone could say, a decade to be sort of independent. So we need to manipulate power with our environment, especially when we're very, very young, to make sure we survive, to make sure we belong. So our power literacy is extremely abusive and extremely manipulative out of our own also, if you want, biological configuration. So I would say, to answer your question, I would ask to every leader to think, where is your power literacy come from? What are the environments that you were born into, how power was applied there, in which way you reinforces your power literacy with the books and the movies and the environments that you expose yourself into, and how can we make, which is literally one of the main focus of my work, how can we integrate other examples and other practices of power literacy to integrate our power literacy in with tools and approaches and practices of other applications of that power, if you want. But I would start with asking, where did you draw your power literacy from? What's your idea of power and leadership?
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gaia, and my questions for you are two, actually. The first one is more general and is about innovation. I want to know, really, what is the unusual and the most unexpected but useful that we are facing today?
Oh, this is such an interesting and complex question to answer in a short way. I would say, useful for what? And useful how? And useful for whom, right? In my opinion, I could think about literally anything from being able to travel anywhere or almost anywhere, at least for our types of passports, so that we can actually learn with other people, and the fact that we can work from anywhere, so we finally can reinvent how we believe the value of our life and our time is. Like, your question is definitely compelling, but it really depends on useful for whom. and useful how? What is useful? Is it that, for example, big debate this week, abortion? We manage to keep leveraging power in ways that we declare to be useful, but for whom? We want to neglect the specific rights on the bodies of women, saying that it is because it's useful and protects the certain things that are important, but it's just one side of that story. And if you ask me to decode that in terms of power, I would find that not very useful for the subject of this type of policy. So it's a very important question, but it's very, very broad. So you said you have that second question?
Yes, the second one is more specific. I want to know if there is a consequence if in our Italian school education, if we change our digital tools and we eliminate all the books and we have all iPad, but since elementary school, and what happened and what could happen if the figure of the teachers will be eliminated and we will have robots to teach to students?
Another brilliant question. I would say that drawing from what I know of cognitive sciences, for example, I would tell you that we tend to, again, focus on the what, on the compelling or not nature of these tools, when one of the questions that I would say it's important to ask is, do we know how our brain develops? Do we know who is informing the technology that we use today? Which statistics does this technology base itself on? Those statistics draw data from whom? Who was actually able to be in those trials and in those studies? So what are the premises that we're building this technology on? And do we know how our brain develops? Do we know that we need a specific nutrition, that there is a reason why our brain develops with paper and not with blue light? Do we know the impact of such cool technology that we sometimes consider, again, savior syndrome? It will solve everything if we give everybody a device for them to be studying from everywhere. But we're forgetting something that in the social impact sector we use quite a lot, which is a human-centered approach to assess the issue. Does everybody have internet? Does everybody have infrastructure to have stable electricity? In most of the countries of the world, that's not the case. I lived there for 5 years in some of those countries. So again, I think that when it comes to education system of any country, probably to put the uniqueness and the very laws of how our brain develops best is more important and will be more important than optimizing whatever form of process through a technology that tends to be designed in a way that is not that inclusive. Because one of the issues, I think, is that education is not inclusive, and the remote education at the moment is lacking a lot of the lenses that are required to address the complex situations we even have just in households, not in terms of necessarily power structure, in terms of like electricity or Wi-Fi to connect these devices, but the environment where a kid is meant to study and grow, and what is healthy and unhealthy for that process.
Thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you.
Okay, we just have 2 more, and then we can conclude. Okay, Alessandro, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alessandro, and I wanted to ask you a question about creativity and design, and in today's world. So, how is it possible to adopt a leadership attitude in today's world, and how can creativity and design help in this, like achieve leadership?
Very fascinating question. Thank you for that. I would say that the design, the power I find of design and creativity is the capacity to imagine and to lay out or to hold the space in a certain way, right? It's like setting up the table for dinner. You can serve soup, but if the designer has not put spoon on the table and just forks or pencils, you can't do much with it, right? So design and creativity have the capacity and the power to make the invisible visible and to set the space and set the table, if you want, for certain things to happen or not happen. And when it comes to leadership, if we keep applying our narratives, stories, creativity, and therefore our processes, design, based on the story of the chosen one, that leadership is power that we project on those that we expect to be better than us, versus the other story, which is nobody's the chosen one or the savior, and yet everybody is. Because everybody has a specific set of powers and tools and resources that they can choose to apply in one way or another. I think that creativity and design and visual, the aesthetic force, the way it is called sometimes, have a great power to narrate new types of story, where it's not about superpowers of some chosen one or whatever, but the capacity that we have to sit down with these questions and find new answers.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. And for the last one, we have Francesco.
So nobody's going to go away crying because they, or very upset because we
everyone's
answered.
Happy. Everyone's
Amazing.
happy. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Francesco. And we talked about the change of paradigm. And my question goes more in a geopolitical orientation. And I would ask you, in your opinion, how the perception of the change of soft power will change nowadays? And more in detail, I would ask you how the perception of the soft power of Zelensky and Ukraine will change.
Guys, I thank you so much for imagining that I have the brain and the time to answer such questions, me not being a geopolitical expert. I really am grateful for the trust that you put on me. I do think that it's a very, very important question. And also when it comes to soft power, I think that there is more layers of this soft power that we're seeing in this current debate, in this current situation. I don't have an answer to offer you. What I have is a reflection that I was lucky enough to share with a few people that tend to know a lot more than I do on geopolitics recently, which is on the fact that we tend to approach political leaders in terms of our judgment towards them as if, one, they are the ones deciding, which is fascinating to me, knowing now that it is very little about the person in the front row. Number one. Number two, the fact that we tend to, for example, consider very often we talk about Trump as this disgrace that happened for a few years, while some sociologists, for example, would tell you, or psychologists, that is the perfect representation of the true story of what America stands for. It just made it more visible, but it was always there. It's not Trump's fault necessarily, which doesn't justify what Trump did or didn't do. And the third thing that I was presented with by these friends, and again, more expert than me on the topic, is what would change in society if we started to look at the leaders, political leaders or community leaders or school leaders or organization leaders, thinking, and this I think also comes from Charles Eisenstein, now that I think about it, what does it take to be you? If those leaders at some point were kids, there is this famous story also on Hitler, right? The fact that he wanted to be a baseball player and he was not allowed to be a baseball player, and that's it took it very far in terms of reaction to it. So, what would change in society if we started to look at our leaders and asking ourselves what happened? Can we trace it back? What happened in terms of what type of power literacy they were exposed to, and therefore ask ourselves back to leadership, in which way we are perpetuating those types of power literacy ourselves. Because nobody imagined, I am sure nobody imagined with that kid that wanted to play baseball that would have happened. But there is a series of things in power literacy that happened along the way. So I don't have a direct answer to your question. I have those questions very much present myself. So whenever, whoever of us figures it out first, we need to somehow, let us know to each other what's the answer. But those are the reflections that really were brought to me that I found quite powerful.
They were very exhaustive. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We are now at the conclusion. I wanted to thank you very much for your time and most of all for your patience in answering our questions. So thank you again for your time. Thank you to Mike Pagani, and thanks to Francesco Galli, Professor Francesco Galli, our professor. Thanks to the class. Thanks to the IT specialists behind the screens that are making all this possible. Thanks to IULM University. And I wish you all a good evening. And I see you along the journey.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.